It's 1320 BCE. The city of Ugarit on the eastern Mediterranean coast is bustling with activity. A local man is just leaving his modest earthen and clay home. He says goodbye to his wife and children, who run after him playfully, pretending to go to work with him. He makes his way through the confusing maze of pathways between houses, shops, and administrative buildings on his way to the harbor. A visitor to Ugarit could easily get lost in this maze, but he knows the path very well, working as a stevedore, loading and unloading ships at the busy port. Ugarit is a significant port city in the region, and is awash with sailors, merchants, and servants. He moves past villagers as they stroll through town, pawing over the wares of local artisans and farmers as donkeys pull merchants' carts through the streets. The smell of fresh-baked bread from the taboon oven fills the air, and he hears multiple languages that he does not understand from merchants trying to draw potential customers to their tents. As he approaches the docks, he sees a ship with several official-looking men standing near it. The ship is large for the time, about 50 feet long, with a single sail and rows of benches for oarsmen. Already a line of men are carrying cargo to and from the ship. He wonders where this ship is from and where it is going. He is told to begin loading the tin ingots into the hold of the ship. The shiny ingots are in an odd shape, like a rectangle with each corner pulled outward to a point. At 50 pounds each, and 1 ton of tin to load, he is happy to have such a large crew to help him. Although not a metal worker himself, he knows very well the tin will be mixed with copper and made into bronze at some distant port city. The sun is hot, and sweat pours from his brow. The usual breeze from the Mediterranean isn't cooperating on this day, and the heat is stifling. He stops to take a drink of water and looks out over the deep blue Mediterranean, dreaming of what life is like in foreign lands. Rising above the city is the royal palace, and it appears to be quite busy on this day. Perhaps it has something to do with the arrival of this ship. There are clay jars of olives, almonds, pine nuts, and figs, and a large quantity of terebinth resin made from pistachio trees. Weapons, tools, glass beads, ivory from elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth, jewelry, and other valuables are marched into the ship as 2 men stand by marking their tallies on tablets. By day's end, his work is done, and he watches curiously as the ship leaves the harbor. He can't help but wonder about the destination of such a rich bounty of items. The ancient shipwreck of Uluburun, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Thank you so much for listening. The account you heard a moment ago is fictional, but it is a reasonable description of life in Ugarit, circa 1300 BCE, during the Late Bronze Age. Ugarit was in what is now northern Syria, north of Israel, and south of Turkey, lying roughly in the middle of several civilizations such as the Mycenaeans, Minoans, Egyptians, Hittites, and Mitanni. It was a major hub of trade during the Late Bronze Age. The merchant ship just described was loaded with many valuables, but it never arrived at its final destination. The ship most likely struck the rocks or some other object, and it sank with all its cargo off the southern coast of Anatolia, near a small strip of land called Uluburun. For over 3,000 years, the ship and its rich cargo remained undisturbed. What was found changed what we knew about the ancient world. This episode delves into the Bronze Age civilizations and the relationships between them. For this reason, I have reached out to Dr. Eric Cline to join me. Dr. Cline is the author of the book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, a book I highly recommend. He is also a professor of classical and ancient Near Eastern studies and of anthropology at George Washington University, and the director of the Capitol Archaeological Institute. Dr. Cline is one of the world's foremost experts on late Bronze Age history and archaeology. I'm very excited that he was able to join me for this episode, and I hope you enjoy the interview. I'm very pleased today to have Dr. Eric Cline with me to discuss the Uluburun Shipwreck. Dr. Cline, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Why don't we start off with a little information about you and your background?
Well, I'm a Bronze Age archaeologist specializing in international connections between Greece and the whole Near East, including Egypt and Mesopotamia, some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So basically, Middle and Late Bronze Age in that region. And I'm an active archaeologist. That means to say I've got an excavation. I dig almost every summer. Right now, my dig is a Canaanite palace up in the north of what is now Israel. Used to be ancient Canaan back then. And besides that, my day job is teaching archaeology and ancient history at George Washington University.
The topic of today's discussion is the Uluburun Shipwreck. Of course, you know that was found off the southern coast of Turkey. It was during the late Bronze Age, but I'd like to start off by giving an introduction to the Bronze Age in general. Could you describe for us the characteristics of civilization that were changing during this transition from the previous Stone Age into this Bronze Age?
Yes, with the caveat, of course, that this is going to hold true for just this particular part of the world. That would be ancient Mesopotamia, the Aegean, and such. That things were very different, say, in Southeast Asia and China and Europe. But in my particular area of the world, which in modern terms would basically be from Italy on the west all the way over to Iran and Afghanistan on the east, and from what is now Turkey down to Egypt for in terms of north and south. In that region, we have a big change in the fourth millennium BCE. That is somewhere between 3500 BCE and 3000. And that is where pretty much everything changes. In terms of the Bronze Age itself, that is usually dated to about 3000 BCE. That's when everything changes. Not only do you have the invention of bronze at that time, which is where you're going to combine 90% copper and 10% tin. If you don't have tin, you can use arsenic. I don't recommend it. You won't live very long, but you could if you have to. And once you've got bronze, that, of course, is much better than all the stone tools that you've been using. But there's more to it than that, because in addition to the invention of bronze, we also have the invention of writing in that area at just about the same time period, somewhere between 3500 and 3200 BCE, definitely by 3000 BCE. We've got both hieroglyphics in Egypt and cuneiform up in Mesopotamia. So cuneiform meaning wedge shaped. So it looks like a bird stepped in ink and walked across the tablet, but it's actually scratched into the clay. So one of the big questions that we've got is who invented the writing systems first? Was it Egypt? And then it spread up to Mesopotamia, which would be modern day Iran, Iraq, northwest Syria. Or did it go the other way around? Did they invent writing up in Mesopotamia and it's made its way down to Egypt at that time? There are evidence for trade and influences going both ways at that time, so we don't know who did it first or if it was an independent invention. So at the time of the Bronze Age, and let's just call it 3000 BCE, you've got bronze, you've got writing, but you've also got a transition from towns and villages to kingdoms and empires. It all takes place at about the same time in this region, and it's probably all related. Basically, you've got, innovations and advancement in technology like bronze, also in writing, and out of that, it may be that people were able to transition from just local towns and villages all the way up to kingdoms and empires. So, you know, 3000 BCE, a little bit afterward, we're suddenly looking at the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. We're looking at the Old Kingdom in Egypt, starting up by 2700 BCE. So it really does change. It's a huge, dramatic change. It's as big as the change to the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, back 5,000, 7,000, 8,000 BCE. So it's a huge, 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 huge change in human history at this time in this area. And then the Bronze Age will go for 2,000 years down to 1,200 or 1,000 BCE. And then there'll be a switch to the Iron Age after the collapse. But we'll get to that.
You mentioned that you were speaking only specifically about your area of the Mediterranean and Aegean, Near East Asia. What was going on in the other parts of the world in terms of this transition? Were they more advanced, less advanced? I'm sure it was different depending on the region.
Yeah, it's different depending on the region, and it actually gets very confusing when you're talking about the Bronze Age in different parts of the world and you don't specify it. So I remember a couple of years ago, there was a headline in the papers that said something like, Bronze Age started later than we thought in Europe. And I'm like, well, it didn't start later than we thought. It started later than in the Mediterranean. Yes, we've always known that. And then the Bronze Age in China is yet again later than that. So each different region of the world comes to this idea of using bronze at a different time, and some never make it there, right? But it's very necessary to specify which part of the world you're talking about. So it's not hugely different when you talk about the Bronze Age in Europe versus the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean and the Near East. It's, 100, 200, 300 years difference at most. But even that's enough to cause confusion when you're trying to figure out when the transition was from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, for example. And that transition happens differently at different times.
This metal alloy bronze, the 90% copper, 10% tin, why was bronze so important?
Bronze is much better for tools and weapons than stone tools. That's not to say that stone tools and weapons went out of use. It's just that bronze takes over, but it keeps a sharper edge and so on. It just makes a lot more sense to use it once you have master the technology to make it. Similarly, iron is that much better than bronze, but it's almost a totally different type of technology that you've got to master. So, one thing replaces another, as has always happened throughout human history. And that's not to say that the previous stuff goes away, it's just that the new stuff is used in addition. So even in the Iron Age, in the first millennium BCE, you still have tools and weapons made out of not only bronze, but also still stone. But now the better ones are made out of iron in the first millennium. Here in the second and the third millennium, bronze just gave the user that much more of an advantage over somebody that was still using stone tools.
And these tools and weapons obviously will help these newly formed kingdoms to go to war with each other. And so, speaking of going to war with each other, as we progress through the Middle Bronze Age into the Late Bronze Age, which kingdoms or regions were the dominant forces?
Well, here's where you get to be a splitter rather than a lumper, because an archaeologist are usually split into one or the other. Some people lump everything together, some people split. If we look specifically, like almost under the microscope, at the Bronze Age in this region, the Aegean and Mesopotamia, um, back in the third millennium, you've got the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. You've got the Egyptians down in Egypt, and then you've got a pre-Hittite people up in Anatolia, what is now modern day Turkey, and also almost like a pre-Hellenic group that's in Greece. All of that changes towards the end of the second millennium BC and the end of the third millennium BC and the beginning of the second millennium. There seems to have been a climate change. There is an event which is now referred to as the 4.2 KYA event, which is a drought that Harvey Weiss of Yale University in particular has pointed out. There's evidence for that drought on all the continents of the entire world, and it especially hits Greece and Turkey and Iran and Iraq in modern terms, such that it brings the civilizations to kind of a crashing halt, and new groups take over. For instance, from the Sumerians, we then get the Akkadians in Mesopotamia, and after that, we get the Babylonians. In Greece, it looks like people that we would call Greeks seem to move in sometime at the end of what's known as the early Helladic period into the middle Helladic period. We also get Minoans, a Minoan society rising up on Crete. And so there's basically a big change at the end of the third millennium, beginning of the second millennium, which is probably related to that climate change, so a mega drought. And interestingly, the exact same thing happens 1,000 years afterward, the so called 3.2 KYA event, which I generally refer to as the late Bronze Age collapse. And climate change and mega drought are part of that. Now, that's all factual. It's accepted by historians, archaeologists. You will get some modern day people scoffing at that point. Oh, you're only bringing in climate change because it's such a, go-to topic today, and you can't tell me that the Hittites had SUVs back then or things like that. But what it boils down to is climate change has been happening throughout the history of the world. And the climate change that we've got today is simply being exacerbated by what humans are doing. But that doesn't mean that nature can't do it quite well on its own. So what we've got in at the end of the early Bronze Age and then again the end of the late Bronze Age is it looks like climate change caused by Mother Nature. And indeed, that does come as a cycle. There have been 6 such episodes during the course of what we call the Holocene. That is the period when humans have been around and interacting. And each of those climate changes have been associated with something dramatic. For instance, the Neolithic Revolution, around about 8,000 BCE, back to 10,000 maybe, that is associated with one of these climate changes. And then end of third, end of second, as I mentioned. So that is something that humans have to deal with, but it also impacts what we know of as the changes in societies and civilizations that are impacted like that. So basically, by the time we get to the second millennium BCE, we have the main people in place that we are used to discussing. That is, Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland, Minoans on Crete. The Hittites will be in place in Anatolia / Turkey by 1700 BCE. You've got Assyrians and Babylonians in Mesopotamia. You've got Cypriots in Crete. You've got Canaanites in what is today Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestinian territories, and Egyptians down in Egypt. So by the time we get to the period that we're interested in today, the Middle Bronze Age and then the Late Bronze Age, everybody's in place, but they're all, I would say, relative newcomers in a way. They've been on the march and the move, and everything really gets settled down by, let's say, 1700 BCE. Everything's in place, and that's going to be during the middle of the Middle Bronze Age, and then we're going to switch over to the Late Bronze Age by about 1550 BCE. That change from middle to late is not because of a climate change or anything like that. It's simply a change in pottery styles, a change in maybe what they're using in their houses, and so on. In other words, we can see a change in the I would say almost the complexity of the society, but it's really based on changes in the material culture. And in part, that's because they start interacting with each other and influencing each other. So, to my mind, that period, the second half of the second millennium BCE, is one of the most interesting periods in ancient history because of the interconnectedness of everyone at that time.
It's quite fascinating. In your book, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, you mention how it was previously thought that there was no interaction between these cultures, that the Egyptians didn't interact with the Mycenaeans, the Hittites didn't interact with the Egyptians. Of course, we know that wasn't true now, and we'll get to that in a bit. So, how would you describe international trade at that time, moving from the middle Bronze Age to the late Bronze Age?
So, what it turns out, there had been some few scholars back decades ago that had argued for connections, say, between Egypt and Greece. But for the most part, they were kind of ignored. And the people that studied Greece did so on their own. People that studied Egypt were on their own. And then, starting in the late 1980s, which seems like eons ago now, but I guess was only 30, 40 years ago. Back when I was an undergrad and then a graduate student, there were a group of us that, kind of unbeknownst to each other at first, had decided that maybe looking at these cultures in isolation didn't make that much sense, and that it made far more sense to see if there was trade and connections and everything else going on. And once we started looking uh, and did a deep dive, it turned out that that was exactly the case. So, for example, what I did is I went around, as part of my dissertation research, I went around to all of the museums on mainland Greece and Crete and the islands, looking for objects that were obviously from Egypt, like, scarabs, and from Mesopotamia and from Canaan, anything that looked Hittite. And to make sure that I was looking at them correctly, I then also got a travel grant to go to Turkey, Syria, Israel, you name it. I went to it and looked at the museums in those places as the areas of origin. But I also looked in those museums to see if there was anything coming, for example, from Greece. Did they have Mycenaean pottery? Did they have Minoan pottery? And so on. And so, what I effectively did was to create a catalog of objects that were found on either end of the trade routes, if you will, and then basically said to everyone, look, you can't say there wasn't any trade because these are examples of it. But the little guys I was looking at were not the actual trade items for the most part, because the main trade items would have been in perishable goods: grain, wine, olive oil, raw materials and raw metals like gold, silver, tin, copper. And all of those would either have disintegrated or disappeared or have been made into other objects, right? You have a gold ring in Greece. The gold is obviously imported because you don't have much native gold in Greece. But now it's been converted into a ring or an earring or something else like that. Similarly, the copper back then is going to come mostly from Cyprus. That's where the vast majority came from. And the tin, even though some of it would be coming from southwestern Turkey in modern terms, the vast majority was coming from what we would now call Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, that region, basically Central Asia. And when it got to Greece, of course, it's going to be made into bronze swords, bronze cauldrons, things like that. So, what I was collecting and what made up my catalog in my dissertation were the little bric-a-brac, the souvenirs, right? You've got a sailor coming over and he's like, "Yeah, I'm trading you this wine and this olive oil and the bronze and all of that. But I've also got this scarab. You want it, only 5 drachmas or whatever." So, and my dissertation advisors at the time said, "What good is this? All you're doing is collecting the bric-a-brac." I'm like, "Yes, but it's symptomatic of the larger trade." And so once I collected these, and there were a couple of thousand that I found, I said, you can't deny any longer that they were in contact. So now the question becomes not were they in contact, but what else came with the objects? What influences, again, writing, religion, stories, myths, what came with it? And so now I'm very pleased that even though the current generation of archaeologists and students has almost completely forgotten what we did 40 years ago, they now take it for granted that these areas were interconnected. And they're like, of course they were trading and with connections. I'm like, okay, good. My job here is done. I can retire. But so it's only been like the last 30, 40 years that people have accepted the extent of the connectedness. And now people like Susan Sherratt, who is at University of Sheffield in England, talks about Mediterranean, the globalness of the Mediterranean, right? So when we talk about everything being global back then, we're still talking local terms, right? So it's kind of glocal, if you will, but the areas of the Mediterranean, the Near East, are connected at that point, and I think that both benefits them all and is a detriment. So sometimes people say that in the seeds that bring a civilization up to greatness will also be contained the seeds that will ultimately cause their downfall. And I think that's exactly what we've got in this case. The societies, and there's about 8 or 9 of them that are interacting at the end of the Middle Bronze Age and into the Late Bronze Age, um, they are connected because they are not self sufficient. They are leaning on each other. And that's good for a couple of centuries. But when things then go south, that interconnectedness, I think, also spells their doom because they can't stand on their own.
I was fascinated and intrigued by your descriptions of the Aegean lists that were found on the bases of the statues at the former seat of government during Akhenaten and his reign in Egypt. What it boiled down to, what I found so intriguing was that it was almost like a ancient name dropping, but it really did describe, as you pointed out in the book, it really did describe the known world at that time.
At that time, yeah. So this is what's known as the Amarna period, and it is both Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh whom you've just mentioned, and his father, Amenhotep III. And actually, a lot of what Akhenaten did, where he basically outlawed the worship of all the other gods and goddesses and said that you could only worship Aten, that actually seems to be an idea that his father, Amenhotep III, started. And the trade and interconnections between Egypt and Greece that you refer to also seems to have started in Dad's time, if you will, in Amenhotep III's time. And actually, the best example that we've got is from his mortuary temple. So, the temple where you would worship his memory after he died, that would have been active during the time of Akhenaten. And in that mortuary temple, of which everything's now gone except for the 2 huge colossi of Memnon that once stood at one of the entrances. They're about 60 feet tall. They're still there today. You can see them. The rest of the temple was taken away. was used as a quarry by later pharaohs building their temples. Why should we go cut more stone blocks when we can just rip apart this temple of a dead king who won't even notice anymore? So it's all gone. But within that, there were these statue bases that you mentioned. There were originally 5 that were found back in the 60s and 70s. And one of the 5 has these names from the Aegean that you mentioned. And they're not just any names, they're big names. The Mycenae, Knossos, so the capital cities of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, the island of Kythera, Nopthion, and so on. There's about 14 names, but there's also 2 names that appear to be the head names for the list. And one is Tanaya, which is mainland Greece, and the other is Keftiu, which is Crete. And so basically, the Egyptians are saying, here are the names on Greece and Crete. And it looks like a geographical itinerary. You can actually follow the names from Egypt up to the Aegean and then back again. They basically go east to west and then east again as if it's a round trip. And then you've got the other statue based list, of which, as I said, there were originally 5. So the other 4 mention other areas. But there is a new set of excavations in that temple. And those excavations have now found another 30 to 35 such statue base with other lists. So it really is the world according to the Egyptians at that time. And they mention places up in Mesopotamia, they say belong to Babylonia and Assyria. They mention places up in Anatolia that belong to the Hittites. They mention names in Canaan. So it's, to me, just another example of the connectivity and the international relations at that time. Why they're actually mentioning them is anybody's guess. They don't seem to be claiming that they conquered them, even though, and here's an interesting cocktail party trivia fact, the way that the Egyptians would depict a name of a foreign place was as a bound prisoner with the hands tied behind their back and kneeling in subservience. And then they would have a fortified oval slapped into the middle of the body with the name of the foreign place. So just the iconography implies that the Egyptians had captured that. But in fact, it's really just an iconographical convention for a foreign place. But what it does for me is show that the Egyptians knew about specific places and areas in the Bronze Age Aegean. And the thing that really brings it home is that excavations at each of the sites on mainland Greece and Crete, there are a number of sites that show that have objects with Amenhotep III's name or his wife, Queen T's name on them, and they correspond to the names on that statue base back in Egypt. So I don't quite know what it's actually representing. Is it a journey? Is it a record of an embassy that was sent? I'm sure the pharaoh himself didn't go, but is this a record of how you get to Greece and back again 3,200 years ago?
I would say it certainly indicates that the Egyptians knew of those places, whether they had visited them or not. They certainly have some experience with them and have heard the
Yeah,
names of those places.
I would agree. And in fact, in some of the Egyptian records, they mention Keftiu ships. That's what they call them, Keftiu ships, Keftiu boats. And Keftiu is the Egyptian name for Crete and the Minoans. So the question is, are these ships that come from Crete, or are they ships that are built to go to Crete? Or are they simply ships that are built using a Minoan design? There's no way to decide between those, but I think it's fascinating that they specifically talk about Minoan boats.
You mentioned the Amarna period as we talked about the statue bases. And so it would be almost impossible to discuss this period without mentioning the Amarna letters. Fascinating reading, interesting style of writing and the way they communicated. But they turned out to be extremely important. What exactly were the Amarna letters and how did they help us?
So you're correct. They're absolutely fascinating. And I'm actually been working on something involving them right now. The, the letters were found in 1887. The story usually told us that a local peasant woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of an ancient site came across these letters. Now, I don't believe that story. I think they were illegally dug up and looted, but the ancient site was the capital city of Akhenaten. It was a new capital city. It had just been set up by him. It's called Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of Aten. And it was only occupied for, a dozen years or so, and then abandoned after his death. But when the city was abandoned, they left part of the royal archive there. It's been suggested that it was all kind of the closed cases, the correspondence that was no longer active, and that when King Tut came to the throne as Akhenaten's successor, that he moved the still active correspondence with him back down to Luxor, where Amenhotep III had been. Um, in this archive, there's about 400 clay tablets, and there are a number of them that are letters exchanged between the so called great kings. That would be the Pharaoh of Egypt, both Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, and they are writing to and from, let's see, the king of Assyria, subsequent kings of Babylonia, one after the other, the king of the Hittites, with the best name from antiquity, Shuppiluliuma I, also the kings and governors of Cyprus, and so on. So we've got these letters between the great kings. But we also have even more letters between the Egyptian kings and their vassal or petty rulers in Canaan. So the king of Jerusalem, for example, a guy named Abdi Heba, the king or governor of Megiddo, a guy named Biridia, and so on. And we've got these letters back and forth that document that they had a lot of the same problems that we've still got today, right? The lesser king whining and complaining to the greater king, why haven't you sent me food? Why haven't you sent me archers? The guy in the next city is attacking me. Don't you care for me? Don't you love me anymore? And so on. These, as I said, these were found in 1887. By, let's say, they were starting to be deciphered almost right away. By 1915, the entire corpus had been deciphered and published, originally in English and French and German. Now, if anybody's interested, there are translations in English from 1992 and 2015. Anyway, they really brought to light and to life the history of that period. So, for example, we now know the dynasties of rulers in Babylonia and in Assyria. We know the people who were ruling at the same time as Akhenaten, and so on. We know the names of the queens, we know the names of the princesses, and we get details about the elaborate marriages and bride prices and dowries that were being sent around. We know that the great kings were trading with each other, but they wouldn't deign to call it trade. That was for the lower merchant classes. What they were doing was exchanging gifts. So I'm going to give you, these 10 mina of lapis lazuli, and I'm going to send you gold statues. And in return, you need to send me X, Y, and Z. So this is what we would today call reciprocity. We do it today too. Think about birthdays. think about Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, any of the holidays where you exchange gifts. And you purportedly do not compare the value, right? Of course not. It's a gift, right? But woe betide you if you give me a cashmere sweater and I give you, a pass to one movie. That's not the equivalent. And they kept tabs on that. And so a lot of the letters between the great kings are actually quite humorous in retrospect, where they would say, "Your father sent me 10 times what you're sending me. And now the gold that you sent me, well, when it got here, I put it in a furnace and melted it down. And it doesn't look like gold at all." To which I'm like, well, whatever happened to trusting your friend? So why did you think you had to put it in a kiln and so on? Anyway, so the Amarna letters are a fascinating look and insight into that time period. And it's all the more important because we don't have that many such archives from that time period. We do have an archive from the Hittite rulers up in Anatolia, which sheds light on what they're doing and their interactions. And then towards the end of the late Bronze Age, we have some archives from a site called Ugarit, which is in what is now the coastal North Syria. And we've got their evidence of trade and exchange. But the Amarna letters were the first of those groups to be found, and everybody was extremely excited, though the initial attempts at translation kind of fell short of being, shall we say, accurate. But it wasn't their fault. I mean, all of these letters, it's rather interesting. The letters of the 400, all but two are written in Akkadian, which is not a language, but a writing system, right? This is the cuneiform. And you could use it to write Assyrian and Babylonian and Hittite and Ugaritic, much like today we use the Latin alphabet to write English and French and German and Spanish and all that. So what they're doing back then is Akkadian was the lingua franca. It was the diplomatic language, just like French was the diplomatic language in Benjamin Franklin's day. So if you're in Egypt, your scribe would be able to write in Egyptian, but also in Akkadian. And if you're up in Anatolia, your scribe would be able to write in Hittite and also in Akkadian, and so on. So there is one letter which is actually written in Hittite, and another letter which is actually written in Hurrian, which is the language of Mitanni in northeastern Syria. But all the others are written in Akkadian. So what they had to do first and foremost when they started to translate it was, first of all, realize they were written in Akkadian, and then also realize they were in a type of Akkadian. It's a Marna Akkadian, which has its own nuances. And so some of the, as I say, some of the early efforts were quite funny in retrospect to what they claimed. But now we've got them and we know what they say, and they're extremely useful for this time period.
I did find some of those letters amusing, especially the vassal kings requesting gold from Egypt using language such as, "Gold is like dust in your land. Please send us a quantity of gold, my brother," and these kind of things. They
Yes.
use such flowery, subservient language, like you said, either calling the king of Egypt father or calling each other brother.
And that actually it brings up an interesting point, and we can look at this almost anthropologically, because if you don't have an actual relationship with somebody in terms of being family, you can make it up. You make up a kinship, and that is where to somebody who is older than you or more powerful than you will call them father. So my father. And if you're writing to someone who is either younger than you or less influential, shall we say, you call them your son. But they also did arrange marriages back then between the great kings and the princesses and such. And so some of the letters, there's one guy, Tushratta, king of Mitanni, who actually writes to the Egyptian pharaoh and says, we are both father and son because you are married to my sister and my daughter. So they had both been sent. And there, when you have the arranged royal marriages, it's not just to shore up a mutual defense treaty, but it's also so that you can trade with each other, or, pardon me, not trade, of course, you can give gifts to each other, right? So they do call themselves my father, my son. The petty vassals in Canaan that you refer to would always have that subservient relationship. They would always be the sons, and they would always call the Egyptian pharaoh my father. Yeah. But then they would say, yeah, gold is like dirt in your land. Gold is like dust in your land. You just pick it up. You don't even notice it. Just send me a bunch. You won't even know you won't even miss it.
So let's talk about the Uluburun shipwreck, because we're venturing into just about that time period now. Late Bronze Age, circa 1300 BCE. The ship was actually discovered in 1982, and a couple years later began excavation. Can you tell us about that? How was the ship found, and how did they begin their excavation efforts?
Sure. So what George Bass and the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M had been doing is regular surveys by boat, uh, where they would go up and down as if they were doing an archaeological survey on land, but they would be towing, radar, sonar, whatever, looking for shipwrecks on the seabed. Then they had kind of an epiphany, and they realized that if they went during the winter months and interviewed the Turkish sponge divers and asked them what they had seen during the previous season of diving for sponges, that essentially the sponge divers were doing their work for them. And sure enough, what happened was in 1982, as you mentioned, they um, there was a young Turkish sponge diver, I think about 17 years old, on his first season of diving, but he had been listening to these visitors from Texas A&M on what to look for. And he came up and he told the ship captain, I just saw a metal biscuit with ears. And the ship captain's like, wait, what? Here, draw it. And when the young sponge diver drew it, he realized that it was an oxide ingot. This is what the copper was transported in. It looks like if you kill an ox or a cow, cut off its head, and splay it out as if it's a rug, that's what it looks like. So there are four corners. You can carry it on your shoulder pretty easily. They each weigh about 60 pounds. So the ship captain contacted George Bass at Texas A&M and said, we think we've got what you're looking for. And so Bass sent over a team and they dove on that particular spot. Sure enough, they found a bunch more ingots. And so in 1984, they started actual excavation, which then lasted for about 12 years. Now, I should add, there's a little bit more of a backstory too, because back when George Bass had been a graduate student at University of Pennsylvania back in the 60s, he had done his dissertation on another shipwreck located not so far away called the Cape Gelidonia shipwreck. And when Bass was excavating that, that was at the time that scuba gear was in its infancy, right? Jacques Cousteau had really just invented it and used it. And that was a shipwreck that dated slightly later, about 100 years later, 1200 BC. Bass published it as his dissertation and said that it was a Canaanite ship that was kind of tramping around the Mediterranean. Well, his dissertation and then the book that he published was met with skepticism by the archaeological community, who at the time were still of the mindset that there was no connection, no globalness at the time. And so Bass had said back in 1967 that he wanted to find another shipwreck that would prove that he had been correct. And that's why he was doing all of this. And so when they started the excavations at Uluburun in 1984, it quickly became apparent that it was a similar type of shipwreck to Cape Caledonia, but bigger and had gone down about 100 years earlier. And in the end, spoiler alert to cut to the chase, the Uluburun shipwreck proved that Bass had been correct about Cape Caledonia as well as Uluburun, and that these were both ships that showed interconnections, though the Cape Caledonia one really is just like almost a guy taking on metal at each port and then tramping around. The Uluburun shipwreck, much more wealthy. It's a microcosm of the international trade that's happening in about 1300 BCE. And it's got items from at least seven, if not eight or nine different societies as part of its cargo. So Bass was vindicated, and the archaeological world, I mean, from 1984 to 1996, we were just sitting up in anticipation when the preliminary reports would appear each year. What'd they find now? What'd they find now? And this was such, the ship was so integral to my dissertation research, because remember, I was doing the imports exports going around, that I actually made two pilgrimages to the site. And on one of them, I got engaged. I actually proposed to my wife while we were en route to the shipwreck. So Uluburun has a very special place in my heart, both personally and professionally for me.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story. Now, when we think about the trade that was going on there and from the evidence found, if there were items from 7 or 8 different regions on the Uluburun shipwreck, you have to wonder that perhaps it was traveling from west to east and then back west.
Yeah, perhaps, but this is part of the problem. And for me, part of why it still remains interesting. We actually, to be perfectly honest, do not know which way the ship was heading. We don't know who sent it. We don't know why. There is two tablets that have been found on board, but the wax inside is long gone. So we don't know if it was a shipping manifest or the itinerary or whatever. So there have been a number of different suggestions that have been put forward. The original suggestion, which you will find in an issue of National Geographic from December 1987, right after the wreck was first being excavated, shows it going around and around and around, tramping from port to port to port. And you really can't see where it begins or where it ends. Now, that is a possibility. There's also a possibility, though, that it might have been one of these royal gifts between one great king and another. And in this case, I would suggest, and in fact, Asafios Orlando and I have suggested a variety of possibilities, that it may be a gift from um, whoever is king in about 1300 BCE. This would be just after the Amarna period, after the time of King Tut. In fact, there's a gold scarab of Nefertiti on there, the wife of Akhenaten, that would never have left Egypt while they were still alive. So anyway, so it may have been a gift from the king of Egypt to the king at Mycenae or the king at Knossos. We just don't know. But the other possibility is that it is sent from Greece to Egypt and the Near East on a shopping expedition. That is, all the goods on board are both raw materials and finished goods that are found at a site like Pylos on mainland Greece. Um, Things that you would use in making perfume, for example. And so we actually, on the ship, in addition to some Canaanite trinkets that show that the majority of the crew were Canaanite, most likely, you also have things that would have belonged specifically to two Mycenaeans. So we were thinking that maybe this was a ship that was sent out on a shopping trip. Okay, we need copper, we need tin, we need resin, we need raw glass. And while we're out, get some milk and cookies and some breakfast pastries, and bring them back. But so we just don't know. Shopping trip, royal gift, private merchants, we don't know. Uh, and which way is it going? I do think it's going from the Near East towards the Aegean, but can't be sure. It did slam into the Cape, the rocky outcrop that is Uluburun, and went down probably pretty quickly because everything is still there. But there have been no skeletons found. So I don't know if everybody survived and was able to swim away, or if they floated or were eaten by fishes or something. But this is one of the great mysteries of the ship. It's amazing what we've got on board. There's something like 300 ingots of pure gold. Sorry, of pure copper. It'd be nice if they were pure gold, but copper at that time was actually perhaps a little more valuable, which is 10 tons worth of bronze. And then there's another ton of tin. So at one point, George Bass said that there was enough copper and tin on that one wreck to outfit an army of 300 soldiers with everything they needed, swords and shields and greaves and helmets and all that. And in one lecture, he kind of jokingly said, when this ship went down, somebody went bankrupt. I don't think that's a joke. I think somebody really did maybe go bankrupt, went belly up because that one ship went down. And of course, that one ship was probably not unique. Think of all the other ships that did make it back and forth. Uluburun didn't make it, Cape Caledonia didn't make it, and we're still finding shipwrecks from that period all the time, but not as wealthy as the Uluburun shipwreck.
The excavation of the shipwreck itself, it was roughly what 140 to 170 feet down. So that's a tough dive. That's not easy. What are other than the depth? What are some of the challenges in doing underwater excavation?
There are lots of them. And in this particular case, the depth probably was the most important because that's off the diving charts, if I'm not mistaken. It's lower than you're supposed to go, really, with scuba gear. Such that, and I'm going on what George Bass and others have said about the dig, because even when I went out to visit the mothership that was hovering above the shipwreck, they wouldn't let me dive. Something about me not knowing how to. I don't know, minor details like that. So, anyway, what they did, they had an entire team of extremely experienced divers, swimmers, you name it. And they would each go down twice a day for only 20 minutes each time. That was it. So they had to know exactly what they were going to do before they went down. And at that depth, the oxygen narcosis that you've got is, as Bass said at one point, it's like you've had two martinis at lunch and then you go back to the office to try and do work. So they had to dive on the ship down 140, 170 feet, 20 minutes as if they had had two martinis. But Bass still claimed, and I believe him, that they were as accurate as any land expedition. And so, over the course of the 12 years and something like 20 or 22,000 dives, they had no major accidents to report. In part, this was because the dive master was a former Navy SEAL and kept everything running, but also because they took very experienced people who would come back season after season after season. So I actually had a couple of friends that were part of the team, and they were incredibly experienced. So that was those were some of the problems: the depth, the time involved, the oxygen narcosis. And then, I mean, just then you have the normal problems with running an excavation, whether it's on land or at sea. You got a group of a dozen, 2 dozen people living together 24/7 for 6 or 7 weeks. By the end of the time, everybody hates each other, right? You've been in too close quarters for too long. But then you reunite for the next season and everybody's best friends again. So you have the typical problems of an excavation as well. But certainly doing an excavation underwater is a whole different kettle of fish, pardon the pun, from doing an excavation on land. But they did it extremely well at Uluburun, and it's held up as an example of what one should do.
And during that time, they found, you mentioned the copper and the tin, the scarab, but there were also just some more mundane things like clay pots, clay jars from Canaan containing olives,
Mhm.
figs, those kind of things. What else was found on the ship that would give some insight in terms of the regions where those items came from?
So, in some ways, the mundane objects are more important than the fancy finished goods because they give us an insight into the daily life at the time. So you just mentioned some of the food that they found. They actually, for one of their final dinners at the end of one of the seasons, they served a meal that approximated what the crew on the ship would have
That's
eaten,
great.
and include things like figs and fish and vegetables and so on. But the mundane goods are also extremely important in terms of things like giving us an approximate date for the shipwreck. So the shipwreck has been dated, I think, no fewer than four different ways. One is the scarab of Nefertiti, which we mentioned, where you know that the ship would not have gone until after she was dead. And she's in power with her husband and then her son from like 1350 down to 1330 BCE, give or take. So you know the ship went down after that. But then parts of the hull, the wood, were found. And there you can not only do dendrochronology, where you count the rings in the wood, but you can also do radiocarbon dating, carbon 14, where you can get the approximate date of the wood there also. So that's already like three different ways. But the mundane pottery comes in as the fourth way because even though there were a number of vessels, lamps, and bowls and the like that were brand new and had never been used and were obviously either about to be sold or given as a gift. There were other pieces of pottery that seemed to have been the possessions of either the crew or the passengers. So there is some used pottery, for example, that is Minoan and Mycenaean, and it may have belonged to those two Mycenaean passengers that seem to have been on the ship. And in particular, one of them is what we refer to as a Mycenaean late Helladic 3B2 Kylix, which is basically it's a type of vase, and late Helladic 3B2 corresponds to the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 12th century BCE. And that kind of put the nail in the coffin, as it were, in terms of the dating of the shipwreck. So most people say it had to have gone down by about 1300 BCE at the latest. And so I always think of the third Indiana Jones movie, the one where you've got Sean Connery as the father, and they're looking for the Holy Grail, and they're in, and they eventually pick this just very plain piece of pottery. I hope this isn't a spoiler alert for anybody, but and the guy guarding it says, "You have chosen wisely," and that's what we have here. Is the most mundane, plain type of pottery. It turns out to be among the most important in terms of dating the wreck. And the irony is that it was sitting on the seafloor right next to a solid gold cup, which I was able to take a look and to handle it one of my trips to the museum. And although gorgeous, it doesn't say anywhere or give any clue as to who made it or where it came from or where it was going to. It's simply a very pretty object, and the mundane ceramic object next to it was, for us, much more important.
Assuming that those jars were loaded somewhere in Canaan, where's the most likely
Mhm.
port that the Uluburun would have stopped?
This is a very good and very difficult question because a lot of the items on board could have been loaded and unloaded at pretty much any port, from Egypt all the way up the coast of Canaan. But what may give us a better look are the Canaanite jars that are found on board. These are storage jars or transport jars, if you will. They could contain anything from figs to glass beads to various other things. And they're really on board the ship. There's about 140 of them. They're really just used as transport jars. But by the time they get to mainland Greece, for example, they're so rare over there that we actually find them later as burial gifts in tombs. But be that as it may, the analysis of those 140 jars has been ongoing for a number of years, and they're able to split the fabric of the jars into two or three or four main groups. And so there is a group that seems to come from northern Canaan, another group that comes from central, another group that comes from southern. So basically, today's terms, we would say Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza Strip. And within that, there are a number of ports that are possibilities. So there's one port, for example, of Abu Huwam. Abu Huwam up northern Israel these days is probably one of the ports that the ship stopped in at. I would say that it almost certainly stopped at Ugarit up in northern Syria. But there are other sites like Tel El Ajul down in what is today the Gaza Strip that may also have been a place for them to stop at. And then, of course, you've got any number of ports on Cyprus. And so the long winded answer is that we can point to a number of different ports that I would suspect the ship put into, maybe on a daily basis, because you don't want to be sailing out at night usually at that time. So each of these ports are about a day's sailing from each other. And so I really do see it kind of hopscotching up the coast and then around off the coast of Anatolia, and then make the short dash over to Rhodes, and then from there to Crete, and there to Kythera and mainland Greece, except that this ship got into trouble while trying to skirt the coast of Anatolia. So the problem is that we can't point to any one particular port and say, this is where the ship came from, because I think it really is ducking in and ducking out and maybe taking on and offloading cargo at each. It really depends on what you think the nature of the boat is. Because if it's a royal gift from one king to another, they're not going to be onloading and offloading. They're just going to stop, get food and water for the night, and then press on. But if it is a private merchant that's buying and selling, then you will be onloading and offloading. And maybe that's why there are items from 7 or 8 or 9 different societies on board.
And the discovery of all those items, of course, plays into the topic of the interconnectedness that we were discussing earlier, and how that really cemented our belief now that these cultures were trading with each other. They weren't isolated, that they knew about each other. They they had ships, they sailed to these foreign ports, and they were actively trading and exchanging gifts.
Yeah, in effect, this is what's the saying? The proof of the pudding. This, I mean, if you found this one ship, which for me is a microcosm of the trade and connections that were going on. I mean, you don't have a ship with 7, 8, or 9 different societies represented unless you've got connections and trade and everything else going on. So, yeah, the fact that this was found in the middle of my dissertation was for me just gravy. I'm like, yeah. The problem that I had is I was cataloging items from Egypt and the Near East found in Greece on the one hand, and Mycenaean and Minoan stuff found in Egypt and the Near East on the other. What do you do with the items that are in a ship that sank almost exactly halfway between East and West? And so what I ended up doing was I did include these objects on the Uluburun ship in my catalog, but I put it in a third category. That is items found on board the Cape Galedonia and Uluburun shipwrecks, because I realized they were neither in the East nor in the West, but they were in transit to both. But I thought that made my argument even stronger there. So, yeah, what I'm waiting for now, and I'm hoping that we will find something soon. I'm greedy. I'm looking. I want another shipwreck, right? I want another Uluburun shipwreck, which will just cement what's going on. And I'm hopeful that that shipwreck will have some sort of writing preserved somehow in it, whether it's an Akkadian or Linear B from the Mycenaeans or Hittite or whatever. If we've got some sort of writing in that ship that can tell us where it was going, where it was coming from, who sent it, why it was sent, that will then one up the Uluburun shipwreck in a way. But I can dream, right? I can dream.
I was reading about the tin found on the Uluburun, and I could be mistaken, but I believe what it was trying to point out was a slightly surprising discovery of where the tin came from. Like you said earlier, most of the tin at that time came from Afghanistan or somewhere around there. But was there tin on the Uluburun that came from somewhere they weren't expecting?
Excellent question and very debated. Now, okay, so it's been how many years since the excavations ended in 96, right? 2006, 2016. It's been like 25 years, right? The analyses of the 10 are only just now being published in the last couple of years. And um, we have different things coming out. And where they're also adding in analyses of other 10 ingots that have been found, for example, off the coast of Haifa in what is now modern day Israel, ancient Canaan. And there have been claims that some of the tin matches the mines up in Cornwall. Now, this has always been a possibility. And even since the 1970s, there have been articles published asking whether the Mycenaeans went up to Wessex and Cornwall in England. And the usual conclusions is yes, but not that frequently, right? Once in a blue moon. And these tin analyses that suggest some of the tin came from that area, they may be correct, but it's not always completely 100% sure where the fingerprint of like the lead that's in the tin matches. There are usually two or three places it could be from. So I don't disagree that the tin on board the shipwreck and maybe off the coast of Haifa, some of it might have come from Cornwall, but I'm skeptical that that was a routine source. The most recent publications, which came out in 2021 and 2022, if I'm not mistaken, so very recently, they were a bit surprising to me because all along we had always been saying, oh, blithely, oh, it comes from Afghanistan, because there is a tablet from the site of Mari on the Euphrates in what is now Syria, which says that tin was coming from Afghanistan to Mari, being then sent to Ugarit, and then being bought by Minoan merchants and shipped off to Crete. So we always knew that the region of Afghanistan was probably where the stuff was coming from. But these new analyses say that a good chunk of it is from southeastern Anatolia, that is modern day Turkey, where again, we always knew there were tin mines that have been exploited from the early Bronze Age on. Aslihan Yener in particular have been investigating them. But the general consensus, which I followed, was that those mines had been played out by the time of the late Bronze Age and that there just wasn't tin available from there. Well, these new analyses indicate that the mines were still active in the late Bronze Age and that maybe at least a third of the tin on the Uluburun ship was from what we would now say modern day Turkey. But the other part, the rest of it, they were able to get more specifically, not just, Afghanistan, but specifically Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and some of the other Central Asian areas. And they said that that's where it was coming from. And they've got pretty good matches there. To my mind, though, that brings up another related question that I've been wondering for a decade or more now, and I haven't got any satisfactory answers, though I've asked a number of people. Namely, who on that end in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, was doing the tin mining and trading with everybody that was in the Near East and the Aegean? We do know there are cultures there, obviously. There is much more we could know about them, but I do not know what they were exchanging the tin for at that end of things, right? We know later at the beginning of the second millennium, not later, but at the beginning of the second millennium, the Assyrians and the Hittites were exchanging tin for silver. And were the people in Central Asia also exchanging tin for silver? Or if we really started excavating, would we find Egyptian objects up there? Would we find Mycenaean and Minoan objects up there? So for me, this is now one of the more interesting unanswered questions. And it may be that I'm simply ignorant of the archaeology up there, but it may be that we need to do more archaeology and figure out who's on that end of the trade route that was providing the tin. So for me, the new analyses of the tin on the Uluburun shipwreck are welcome for the most part because they're telling us now where they got the tin. But as always in archaeology, they are bringing up more questions than they have answered. So I look forward to more publications. I mean, the whole ship, the shipwreck, the objects have not been published in final form yet. We still have the preliminary reports for most of the stuff. I do know people are working on it, and I'm hopeful that the final volumes will appear in my lifetime. Uh, so, in part, I can correct everything that I said that was wrong in the past, or to see if I was right about everything. I mean, you never know. But we have that to look forward to. I think we're going to have a lot more surprises when the other analyses come out and the final publication of this amazing cargo, just absolutely amazing cargo on the Uluburun shipwreck.
The items found stretch from Afghanistan, potentially with the tin, all the way through the Aegean down into Egypt. So it really does show what kind of massive international trade network was happening at that time. Not global, but for them, it was all of their known world.
Exactly, the globalized Mediterranean, as they say. There's even at least one object from the Balkans, and then if there's any amber on there, that will come up. That will come from that area as well. So there may be indications, small, slight, of connections with Central Europe also on the ship.
And thinking about the collapse that is about to come in the late Bronze Age, it reminds me of even now how connected we are, much more so. Any one piece fails and everybody else is affected. Our economies are affected by each other across the globe. Shipping, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, created shortages and panic of not being able to buy toilet paper. So, I mean, from a modern perspective, I can see how any kind of breakdown for any reason in their world could trigger some kind of collapse. The late Bronze Age collapse happened very rapidly. Was all of this already in motion at the time of the Uluburun shipwreck?
Not really, but it happened soon thereafter. At the time of the Uluburun shipwreck, they are still enjoying the last gasp of the heyday, shall we say. After 1300 BCE, and in particular after 1250, that they really start to suffer when we get written in the texts things saying like, we have drought, we have famine. And then by just after 1200, by about 1177, we've got then mentions of invaders coming from the sea, the so called sea peoples. So the Uluburun shipwreck, there everybody's still doing basically well. By the time of the Cape Galedonia shipwreck, 100 years later, 1200 BC, everything's in chaos. So the two shipwrecks actually give us kind of bookends between the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of the collapse. So, and then it does, as you say, happens quite rapidly within just a matter of decades. And I do think, as we referred to earlier, it was because of the interdependency. It was because of the Mediterranean globalness. Uh, because when they started going down, when one cog got out of place and the whole machinery just flew into chaos, right? In the book, I make a reference to one thrown rod going through the engine of a high-priced race car reduces it instantly to scrap metal, and it's that way too. What we've got is a systems collapse where if the Hittites go down, that impacts everyone else. If the Cypriots go down and you can't get copper anymore, that impacts everybody. If the trade routes to Afghanistan or Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan are cut off and you can't get tin anymore, you're talking supply chain issues on a grand scale, right? I mean, forget about your toilet paper. If you can't get tin, you're in real trouble, right? And I think of that ship that was stuck in the Suez Canal for like a week or so. Um, that epitomized for me what was happening, and I do see this around today. I'm not. I wasn't raised to be a chicken little running around saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling, but that was the conclusion that I came to. 1177 BC first came out in 2014, and thereafter more evidence came out, and we got more and more towards a similar situation. So in 2021, when I published the revised version, I was basically saying it's deja vu. The late Bronze Age collapse is it's not if it's going to happen, it's when, and it's going to happen to us. And what are we going to do about it? But the flip side of the coin is that question of what do you do after your international network collapses? What do you do after you've got a catastrophe? And you either have resilience um, or not. You either transform or not. You either adapt or you don't. And so that's what I was working on the last couple of years, which will be out in May of 2024, is after 1177 BC, and the simple question of what happened in the centuries after the collapse. Who came back? Who didn't? Spoiler alert, some of them were able to successfully transform, others not so much. You don't have anybody wandering around today calling themselves a Mycenaean or a Hittite. But that, to me, also has implications for us today. Because if we can look at the Iron Age after the collapse and see what some did and some didn't, and then apply it to ourselves, saying, okay, if it's a matter of just when are we going to collapse, Then we've also got the question of how are we going to deal with it? How can we prepare for it ahead of time? What are we going to do afterward? And again, are there any lessons from antiquity that might be able to help us? And I think there again, the answer is yes. From the period just after 1200 BC, I think that holds a lot of lessons for us today. But I won't go into any further detail because all the listeners have to pre order the book and go from there.
That's right. No, I have read your book that we've been talking about. I have not read the revised edition, however, so I look forward to reading that and to your new book coming out after 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations. Uh, what are you working on at the moment? What kind of projects or excavations are you involved with?
So, a couple minor projects, a chapter here, a chapter there for edited volumes and handbooks, but for fun, I've been working, as I mentioned earlier, on something with the discovery of the Amarna letters and the initial translations. We'll see if that goes anywhere. I'm about halfway through it now, but mostly just playing around. I'd say the big thing is getting back to our excavation at Tel Kabri in what is now the north of Israel. We haven't been back since 2019, since before the pandemic. But on the last days of the excavation that summer, um, in the same Canaanite palace where we had previously found the oldest and largest wine cellar found anywhere in the Bronze Age Near East, we also found during that last week, and again, there's a saying in archaeology the best things are always found on the last day, which is true. In this case, it was like 2 or 3 days from the end. But we went in a sample test pit, we went below one of the plaster floors in the palace and got down to a previous floor that we knew was there, but obviously didn't know what it looked like. Turned out it's painted, and it's painted in what I think is an Aegean style type of painting, which matches a painted floor that had been found back in 1989, 90, 91 by the previous excavation that is Aegean style and shows that the Canaanites were in contact with the Aegean area in not the late Bronze Age, but the Middle Bronze Age. So, because the site dates to about 1800 BCE, the same time period as the Mari letters that we referenced earlier. And so we only uncovered a very little piece of that painted floor, like 10 centimeters by 15 centimeters, but the whole room that it's in is 3 meters by 10 meters. So 10 feet by 30 feet, and the whole floor should be painted. Now, we won't uncover the whole floor, right? You never do that. But I'd like to uncover a third to a half of the floor and see what designs are there. I already know that they're using orange and red and brown and black. I can see those colors in the little piece that we exposed already. But I want to go back and get the rest of that floor. And then we've barely scratched the surface of this site, which is absolutely fascinating. And there aren't that many Canaanite palaces that have been excavated. So that's high on my list of priorities. And I'm hoping that we will go, in fact, in the summer of 2024. So, if anybody's listening and wants to go on a land excavation as opposed to underwater, um, free to write to me and see if we're taking people on. But so that's, I'd say, the big project in the future is going back and resuming the excavations at Tel Kabri.
And where can listeners find you, information about you and your work?
I'm pretty much all over um, the internet these days. I'm on Facebook. I think as Eric Cline. I'm on Twitter, or what remains of Twitter these days, as Dig Cabri, all one word. I also, for a while, was maintaining my own website, which I think is still up. something like ericHklein.com or whatever, but you can also just Google me and up come the sites at GW and elsewhere. And then you can always go to Amazon where all the books are for sale. So I'm easy to find. I'm not hiding. I'm all over social media. So if you want to find me, you can. Just be aware that at last count there were also 37 or 38 other Eric Kleins active on social media. So you have to make sure that you get the archaeologist and not the Canadian minister of the same name.
He probably would not be able to answer any archaeology questions.
No, nor I any health related questions.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Eric Cline, it was a pleasure to have you. I'm really honored that you agreed to participate in the podcast. I really appreciate you being here with me.
Well, thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here, and always fun to talk about the Late Bronze Age, and in particular, the Uluburun Shipwreck.
That's going to do it for the Uluburun Shipwreck. Thank you so much to Dr. Eric Cline for joining me. I really appreciate him being here. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. Social media links, episodes, images, and sources can be found at shipwrecksandseadogs.com, and you can follow the show at ShipwrecksPod on social media. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret or on the web at sean.siegfried.se. You can also subscribe to the premium version of Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on the Into History podcast channel. You'll enjoy perks such as ad-free listening, bonus content, exclusive events, and access to all the great history podcasts on the network. Go to intohistory.supercast.com to join. Thank you again for listening, and until next time, don't forget to wear your life jackets.